This is great. This is kind of like the good old days. So our first year as a church, this was oftentimes our attendance on a like Sunday evening at 5 o'clock. I'm not kidding. This was like something we did on a regular basis. I asked my wife this morning how she felt about being indoors, and she said it felt a little bit like coming home because this is the first time that we have done this since March, which in some ways wasn't that long ago, and in other ways feels like an eternity. I mean, think about all that's happened since March, right? So all that's happened in your life, all that's happened in the life of our church, all that's happened in the life of our country. It's been a really tumultuous several months, and yet here we are, and our church is still around, and we're still hanging on, and in fact, in many aspects, we are continuing to grow, which I'm very thankful to God about. I think that if there's anything that I've felt or sensed consistently, it's that God is by no means done with our vision and mission for the city of Inglewood, and we get to continue to be a part of that on a regular basis, which is really great. It's really timely, too, that we're sort of hearing that and sensing that from God regularly, because this is the time of year where we go back to our vision and values as a church. Our entire family of churches does this. All three of the churches look to what is it that makes our church tick. I've been a part of a lot of churches and organizations in the past that have been all about sort of reaching particular goals and sort of arriving at those goals and setting new goals and then arriving at those goals and so on and so forth. We've chosen these particular directions, however, as a church to be our values as a church, our vision as a church. And these directions, these vectors or these trajectories are lanes that we follow in. These are directions that we move in, never arriving, but rather continuing to pursue this way of Jesus. That is our hope and that's our aim. And so when people ask us what kind of church we are, or ask me that at least, and I think many of you say this as well, I say we're a parish church. Our job is to take spiritual and social specific geography. But beyond that, the question oftentimes comes up, well, how do you do that? What does that actually look like? And the answer to that question is what we're going to be talking about throughout the month of October. We are following the way of Jesus together by moving up towards the Father in prayer and in worship, moving in towards ourselves and towards other people in healthy, deep, meaningful relationships, and then moving out towards the city as we engage government and businesses and schools and our literal neighbors. That's what we do. That's how we do what we do, I should say, as we move up, in, and out together. These are really simple, but I would also say that this is probably the most fully orbed or holistic version of following the way of Jesus I've ever encountered and been a part of. And so some people feel like it's overly simplistic, but honestly, if I'm thinking about just my own life and my own growth, it's actually been extremely meaningful, and I hope it is that to you as well. This evening, I get to talk to you a little bit about what it looks like to move in towards each other. And I want to be clear on what I mean by that. We've used the in direction in a couple of different ways. One way is in towards ourselves, understanding ourselves better, whether it's mentally or emotionally or spiritually or vocationally, relationally, whatever it is. And that's a really important journey, and that's not something that I have time to talk about much tonight. Rather, tonight what I want to do is talk about something that I see is more at risk for our community, and that is our relationship with each other. That is the way that our church, whether it's in the form of small groups or table groups rather, or in our actual worship gatherings, or however we're connected, I see the fabric or the threads that kind of hold us together beginning to fray. Not just for our church really, but for Christians in general. I think if we're at risk of anything at this very moment, it's as Christians being pulled away from each other. We live in a very divisive time where the rift between two people with different opinions is only growing. It seems like we're only getting farther and farther apart. And you have lots of people, and you might feel this tension in your own life, who call themselves Christian and disagree with another person who calls themselves a Christian. And it seems like we're moving farther and farther away from each other. And I think that there's something to be said about that, and I hope that we can do that tonight. One of the reasons why we continue to feel this void, and one of the reasons why I think this direction of moving in is at risk, is because conflict is difficult, and conflict feels like a threat. But let me tell you that conflict has never been something that has toppled or outrun or overdone the way of Jesus. It is something that has consistently been either overcome by the church, or it's actually contributed to the health and the strength of the church. I'm going to do a quick crash course through the Bible here, and I'm just going to show you that conflict has been a part of relationship all along. You'll see it in pretty much every single chapter of the entire Bible. Did you know that the first 25 chapters of the Bible, the first 25 chapters of the book of Genesis, are devoted to brotherly feuds specifically? I didn't know this either until V.M. Vargas said it in the third season of the FX show Fargo. I don't know what kind of research you were expecting for this homily, but you're welcome. Relationships in the Bible are fraught right from the very beginning of human history. Adam and Eve experience strife when Adam blames Eve for making him eat the fruit. Cain kills Abel, his own and only brother. Jacob tricks Esau. Joseph is sold into slavery by his older brothers. The list goes on. And of course, because these are ancient texts, they are focused particularly on male conflict. They don't even talk at all about what's happening with the ladies during that time. In a patriarchal society and era, the male perspective was the only one that was considered worth recording, which is why it's remarkable and even authenticating that we have the stories of Ruth and Esther and many other women in the Bible. Presumably, though, I think we can assume this since women are human beings, there was plenty of female conflict happening at that time as well. There's human conflict recorded in the wisdom literature in Ecclesiastes, and most recently, our church saw it recorded in the book of Job as Job's friends are supportive at first and then eventually try and turn on him and sort of just mansplain everything to him throughout the rest of the book. The book of Jonah is about conflict. The book of Lamentations and Jeremiah are about conflict. The minor prophets, the shorter ones that we don't really read very often, those are oftentimes about conflict. If you were to go back a little bit farther, prior to some of the ones I just listed, you would see that the book of Exodus is really about conflict. A group of people who were enslaved for hundreds of years rise up to claim their freedom. And literally as they're running out of town, their conflict is so high, it's even fatal and life-threatening. The intertestamental books recorded that go between, record history between the testaments that didn't make it into our canon, these are rife with conflict, dripping with conflict. The lineage of Jesus in Matthew is just a list of names, but if you go and follow the storylines of any one of those people, it's really about conflict. Jesus is born into conflict. Herod tried to kill him quickly and early. John the Baptist, who was meant to prepare the way for Jesus, was because of the things he was saying, his message about Jesus. Jesus' disciples were oftentimes a part of conflict, causing conflict, involved in conflict. Within a week of the Palm Sunday celebration, as Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem, he is arrested for treason and heresy and much more, and brutally murdered by the majority culture for his minority views. After the resurrection and ascension, there's this event called Pentecost where the Spirit of God descends. And even in that moment, the assumption is that these people were faking it or these people were drunk. And Peter has to kind of stave off the crowds because they are ready for conflict. The Bible ends with the book of Revelation, a book about a spiritual war that ends with victory for the good side, but not with terrible consequences and plenty of pain along the way. The Bible, which is the primary source for our understanding of theology and anthropology, our primary revelation from God as Christians, is filled from cover to cover with conflict. And yet, I am convinced that healthy relationships are not just important, but core to who we are as followers of the way of Jesus. Conflict can't be the thing that keeps us from pursuing those relationships. If anything, conflict could be a tool that's used to help us deepen those relationships. I want to zoom in for a minute on the Gospel of John. If you're familiar with the New Testament, you'll know there's 4 Gospels. 3 of them are actually about sort of some of the same stories. They kind of go through some of the same stories about Jesus and his disciples. And then we get to the book of John. And the book of John is actually written probably quite a bit later than the 3 synoptic Gospels. The book of John does a lot of filling in of some of the gaps and holes. He kind of looks back and gives a little bit of commentary, explains why. In this particular case, he adds a story to a story that we've heard plenty of times. You've heard the story of the Last Supper. You've heard the story of communion. You've heard this story that we partake in every single week when we take the bread and the wine. But you haven't maybe heard this particular part of the story that John adds in here. I'm going to read it to you. You can find it in your liturgy in chapter 13. I'm going to start in verse 2. It says, the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, and he took off his outer clothing. He wrapped a towel around his waist, and after that he poured water into a basin, and he began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. And he came to Simon Peter, and he said, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, do you not realize now what I am doing? You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Peter was a little dramatic, right? He went from don't touch me to wash me entirely. Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew that one was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. Verse 12, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I've done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set to you as an example that you should do this. You should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." Then if we jump down to verses 34 and 35, which is after Jesus has talked about the Last Supper, he's talked about being betrayed, he's talked about going to his death, he says, "A new command I give to you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have loved one another." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In this chapter, Jesus presents the what, the why, and the how of pursuit of healthy and deep relationships. I think you and I tend to see relationships sometimes as relationships that can serve us, sometimes relationships where we can get as much as we can out of them. Sometimes relationships are sort of one-sided or one-dimensional, but there's so much more to a healthy relationship. Think about the way that Jesus pursued these friends of his. For 3 years, he pursued 12 of them. The Son of God had 12 people that he continued to invest in and continued to care for, and ultimately, at this apex moment, serves them. This is a highly unusual situation where the host of a party would kneel down and clean somebody's feet. The roads were dirt. There were livestock and animals in the town where they were traveling. They were wearing sandals. And so when he's cleaning their feet, he's not cleaning feet that had been in shoes and socks all day. He's cleaning feet that had mud and blood and poop on them. And he's not only the host of the party, which would already be unprecedented, but he is the Son of God. And he kneels down to wash his disciples' feet. He goes through, like I said, the what, the why, and the how of what these relationships are. What is a healthy relationship as we see it through this lens of this story? Healthy relationships are core to who we are as Christians. If there's anybody in the world that should be able to pursue healthy relationships, it should be us. And yet oftentimes, guilty as anybody of having unhealthy relationships. Throughout the 3-year period that Jesus was actively teaching and leading, he was actively also building into these 12 people, intentionally, specifically, and consistently. This is what it takes to have a healthy relationship with a friend, with a family member, somebody who lives with you, somebody who doesn't, somebody you work with. It takes intentionality, and it takes a lot of time. Secondly, why? Why do we pursue these healthy relationships? Why does Jesus do this in this particular story and for the 3 years prior? Our primary association with Jesus is displayed in our love for each other. Now, if somebody were to ask you about your spiritual health or your spiritual growth, you might tell them something about how often you practice different spiritual disciplines. You might tell them something about how often you worship or how you worship. You might tell them about something about your prayer life. These are all a part of what we kind of put in that upward lane, that lane where we move toward God. But Jesus says here that the primary indicator of our spiritual health, our primary indicator of our association with and attachment to him, is actually our love for each other. We display our love for him primarily in the way that we love one another. This is why we pursue these healthy relationships. I think that we, in some ways, have our metrics for our spiritual health all wrong. That isn't to say that we shouldn't or can't pursue worship and prayer, and that these aren't good indicators for our spiritual health, but isn't it interesting that Jesus doesn't say anything here about what we would call quintessential worship, but he says something here about the way we engage and love each other. This is something that the early church caught on to quickly. There's a book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church by a guy named Alan Kreider, which I highly recommend. If you're interested in church history, you should read it. It's fairly dense, but it's really, really fascinating. And one of the things he continues to come back to is that the early church didn't employ any of the church growth tactics or strategies that people employ today. In fact, a gathering like this in the first century would have actually been closed to outsiders. It would have been the sort of thing where you would only have people who were sort of card-carrying members of your community who would come in and be a part of it. Of course, that's not how we do church today, and I think for good reason. But what's interesting about what he says in his stories is people couldn't stop trying to get in because they saw how the people of the church loved each other. They were so blown away by it, so mesmerized by it, and so in desire for it and craving it that they wanted to be a part of it. They were, you've heard the story in the book of Acts, particularly Acts chapter 2, right? Where the people of God are together, they're sharing everything in common, and there is this line that we pull in our generosity prayer, there was no one in need among them. They needed nothing. That story is about a group of believers. That story is about a group of Christians who were taking care of each other to such a great extent that not a single one of them had need. Word got out about that really quickly, and people wanted to be a part of that. And all of a sudden, you saw the church begin to grow, even though it wasn't trying to do so necessarily. It became an evangelism strategy, actually, for them to just simply love each other really, really well. And if I'm frank with you, that is not my observation of Christians right now. It is not my observation, maybe of really anybody, but I don't see particularly Christians, and I'm not picking on our church specifically, I'm just saying more generally, it's not my observation that Christians are caring for each other in such a way that it's infectious and that other people want to be a part of it. In fact, like I said at the beginning, what I see right now are massive rifts between people, division, divisiveness. We're missing the opportunity that we have to bond ourselves to each other, to be loyal to each other, and to care for each other because we share a common identity in Christ. Lastly, how? Jesus shows us exactly how we are to pursue these healthy and deep relationships. And there's two ways that he does this, and I put them in your liturgy, but if you don't have that for some reason, let me know. I can show you later. The first one is through non-reciprocal service. Non-reciprocal service, which is when we seek to serve someone with no expectation that they will return the kindness. When we seek to do something for somebody because we believe in the relationship or we believe in that person so much so that we want to care for them in that way. This is very countercultural to what we experience as modern Americans, isn't it? The reason why is because we've allowed our economic system of capitalism to sort of seep outside of the bounds of our relationships, outside of our occupational relationships into every other relationship. And we think about things transactionally. If I do something for someone, what are they going to do for me back? Or if I do something for that person, how do I get something in return? And you know that if you've been in a healthy, deep relationship, you can't always expect something from somebody in return. Particularly if you're caring for somebody who has a particular need in their life. So like, for instance, I'm caring for children in our home with some sort of regularity, and those kids have lots of needs. And there's no way those kids are ever going to reciprocate to me what I'm giving to them. That's part of what it means to care for and to serve in a non-reciprocal way. You might find opportunities to do this for a spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a roommate or a coworker, or maybe a parent of yours, somebody you can care for in a non-reciprocal way. These aren't transactional relationships. These are service relationships. The second way that Jesus models this for us is through role reversal hospitality. Role reversal hospitality, which is when we seek to serve regardless of our status in comparison to another person. So back to the sort of the scene, if you will, where Jesus gets down on his knees with a basin of water and a towel, and he cleans the feet of his disciples, and Peter specifically, but I'm sure they were all very weirded out by that, okay? Again, unprecedented for the host of a party, not to mention the Son of God, to be down on their knees to wash poop and mud and blood off of the feet of his friends. And yet this is what Jesus does. He stoops down. There's a book called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction by a guy named Eugene Peterson. And in that book, he talks in several ways about the way that God stoops down to be on our level, if not below us, and then stands alongside us in that position and in that posture. And this is exactly what we see here in this expression. Overall, what I think Jesus does for us here, when he says, this is the expectation I have for you, is that you would do this. He doesn't say you should literally wash each other's feet by saying that. No more than he says you should literally go and be crucified when he says, take up your cross and follow me. What he means is I'm setting an example for you. I'm showing you what it means to invest in a relationship. And by the way, it's kind of gross sometimes. It's kind of hard sometimes. It doesn't oftentimes pay you back, and that's not really the point. My hope is that our church, whether it's through our table groups or our growth groups or in our worship gatherings in the morning or in the evening or in your friendships with each other, your roommates, your neighbors, whatever you want to look, however you want to look at this, my hope is that our church would grow in our bond with each other, that we would show the world what we believe by the way we love each other. That's my hope for us, is that we would continue to use that or sort of growth or evangelism strategy or whatever, that we would be so good at caring for each other that other people would see the way our church does that and go, I'd like to be a part of that actually. I'd like to belong to a group that cares for me in not only a non-reciprocal way, but in a role reversal hospitality way. I believe that's possible. I believe it's possible because I've seen many of you model it for me. I've watched you serve each other. I've watched you serve me and my family. I've watched you serve your neighbors. And let me tell you that it is one of the most beautiful expressions of God's love when we are learning to love each other. Heavenly Father, thank you for an opportunity to gather together. Thank you for the book of John and just what it's meant to me and so many of us, I think, over the years, just seeing this different perspective on all the things that you're doing and all the things you've done. I pray, God, that we would learn to care for each other in these really important, selfless and humble ways that are oftentimes not that pretty. And yet are an expression of the way that you've loved us. We love you, and we pray these things in your name. Amen.